Sue Janke will read for us this morning. Sue?
Our scripture is from Jeremiah 17, 5 through 10. Am I there? Thus says the Lord, cursed are those who trust in mere mortals and make mere flesh their strength, whose hearts turn away from the Lord. They shall be like a shrub in the desert and shall not see when relief comes. They shall live in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes, and its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought, it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. The heart is devious above all else. It is perverse. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, test the mind and search the heart, to give to all according to their ways, according to the fruit of their doings.
Thank you, Sue. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. The word tree is mentioned in the Bible around 200 times and over 36 varieties. How important have trees been in your life? When I was a child, we had a big backyard right next to the church in the little town of Rushmore, Minnesota. There were many small trees that had been planted when the new manse was built, but there was one large shade tree that was central to our outdoor playtimes. Its roots went deep and its branches spread wide. Dad built us a sandbox around the tree, partly so my red-haired little brother could play in the shade and not get burned by the sun. My older brother built a platform on a thick branch that extended out, and he nailed boards to the trunk to climb up. I imagine this wondrous bird's eye view helped to age my mother. In the fall, we gathered the leaves that fell and we made piles to jump in, or we distributed the leaves into imaginary floor plans that we then played house in. In the winter, assorted sticks and branches worked their way into snow forts and snow people. We had a special relationship with our tree. As the climate crisis makes itself known, we must recognize the importance of trees on the earth, not just for play and recreation, but as the lungs and the air conditioners of the planet. There's a movement you may have heard of called forest bathing. Researchers have found that spending time outdoors among the trees has numerous physical and mental health benefits. In Canada, health officials are starting to take note of these benefits, and they've launched a new program that allows its doctors to prescribe free annual passes to the country's national parks to improve their patients' well-being. Trees have much to teach us about strength, about nature, about beauty, about life, and the interrelatedness of everything. It's no wonder Jeremiah and the psalmist draw on the image of trees in their writings. The psalmist implies that God is the gardener, planting the trees by flowing waters, conveying a sense of flourishing, rootedness, and productivity. To delight in the Torah, the law, is to drink from its waters. To deliberate on Torah is to sink one's roots beside its nourishing streams. For Jeremiah, the one who trusts in God is given elevated botanical status. Jeremiah was a prophet to his people during a stormy time. He began his service in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He lost his home, along with others, when Jerusalem was conquered and destroyed by the Babylonians. He ended his career with his people in exile. Now, Jeremiah preaches a troubling message. The people will not be going home. So, how will they choose to live with exile as their new norm? Will they be like the shrub in the desert and not see when relief comes? Or will they trust God and be like a tree planted by water, sending its roots by the stream? So, the text from Jeremiah about being a tree that is hopeful and survives the drought has contextual meaning that feels relevant during an ongoing pandemic exile. It has theological implications for how we trust and grow in God. And its metaphorical images are in tune with the need to care for God's creation and the need to plant literal trees. Through this week, as I dwelt on the Jeremiah passage, I kept coming back to a story I read long ago to my children. It's called The Man Who Planted Trees by Jean Giono, originally copyrighted in 1954. Taking my cue from Jesus, who frequently taught by telling stories, I'm going to read it to you. It's a bit on the long side, so get comfortable and relax and listen. It speaks to this time when the creation is crying out, and it speaks of the hope presented by Jeremiah. This is The Man Who Planted Trees. And it speaks from the author's voice, from his own experience. About 40 years ago, I was taking a long trip on foot over mountain heights quite unknown to tourists in that ancient region where the Alps thrust down into Provence. All this at the time I embarked upon my long walk through the deserted regions. It was barren and colorless land. Nothing grew there but some wild lavender. I was crossing the area at its widest point, and after 3 days walking, found myself in the midst of an unparalleled desolation. I camped near the vestiges of an abandoned village. I'd run out of water the day before and had to find some. These clustered houses, although in ruins, like an old wasp's nest, suggested that there must have been a spring or well here. There was indeed a spring, but it was dry. The 5 or 6 houses, roofless, gnawed by wind and rain, the tiny chapel with its crumbling steeple, stood about like the houses and chapels in living villages, but all life had vanished. It was a fine June day, brilliant with sunlight, but over this unsheltered land, high in the sky, the wind blew with unendurable ferocity. It growled over the carcasses of the houses like a lion disturbed at its meal. I had to move my camp. After 5 hours walking, I still had not found water, and there was nothing to give me any hope of finding any. All about me was the same dryness, the same coarse grasses. I thought I glimpsed in the distance a small black silhouette, upright, and I took it for the trunk of a solitary tree. In any case, I started toward it, and it was a shepherd. 30 sheep were lying about him on the baking earth. He gave me a drink from his water gourd, and a little later took me to his cottage in a fold of the plain. He drew his water, excellent water, from a very deep natural well above which he had constructed a primitive winch. The man spoke little. The place was in order, the dishes washed, the floor swept, his rifle oiled, his soup was boiling over the fire. He shared his soup with me. It was understood from the very first that I should spend the night there. The nearest village was still more than a day and a half away. And besides, I was perfectly familiar with the nature of the rare villages in that region. There were 4 or 5 of them scattered well apart from each other on these mountain slopes at the extreme end of the wagon roads. They were inhabited by charcoal burners, and the living was bad. Families crowded together in a climate that is excessively harsh, both in the winter and in summer. Irrational ambition reached inordinate proportions in the continual desire for escape. The men took their wagon loads of charcoal to the town and returned. There was rivalry in everything, over the price of charcoal as much as over a pew in the church, over warring virtues as over virtues and vices, as well as over the ceaseless combat between virtue and vice. And over all there was the wind, also ceaseless, to rasp upon the nerves. The shepherd went to fetch a small sack and poured out a heap of acorns on the table. He began to inspect them one by one with great concentration, separating the good from the bad. I smoked my pipe. I did offer to help him. He told me it was his job. And in fact, seeing the care he devoted to the task, I did not insist. That was the whole of our conversation. When he had set aside a large enough pile of good acorns, he counted them out by tens, meanwhile eliminating the small ones or those which were slightly cracked, for now he examined them more closely. When he had thus selected 100 perfect acorns, he stopped and we went to bed. The next day I asked if I might rest here for a day. The rest was not absolutely necessary, but I was interested and wished to know more about him. He opened the pen and led his flock to pasture. Before leaving, he plunged his sack of carefully selected and counted acorns into a pail of water. I noticed that he carried for a stick an iron rod as thick as my thumb and about 1.5 yards long. Resting myself by walking, I followed a path parallel to his. His pasture was in a valley. He left the dog in charge of the little flock and climbed toward where I stood. I was afraid he was about to rebuke me for my indiscretion, but it was not that at all. This was the way he was going, and he invited me to go along if I had nothing better to do. He climbed to the top of the ridge, about 100 yards away. There he began thrusting his iron rod into the earth, making a hole in which he planted an acorn. Then he refilled the hole. He was planting oak trees. I asked him if the land belonged to him. He answered no. Did he know whose it was? He did not. He supposed it was community property, or perhaps belonged to people who cared nothing about it. He was not interested in finding out whose it was. He planted his 100 acorns with the greatest care. For 3 years, he had been planting trees in this wilderness. He had planted 100,000. Of the 100,000, 20,000 had sprouted. Of the 20,000, he still expected to lose about half to rodents or to the unpredictable designs of Providence. There remained 10,000 oak trees to grow where nothing had grown before. That was when I began to wonder about the age of this man. He was obviously over 50. 55, he told me. His name was Elizar Bouffier. He had once had a farm in the lowlands. There he had had his life. He had lost his only son, then his wife. He had withdrawn into this solitude where his pleasure was to live leisurely with his lambs and his dog. It was his opinion that this land was dying for want of trees. He added that, having no very pressing business of his own, he had resolved to remedy this state of affairs. I told him that in 30 years his 10,000 oaks would be magnificent. He answered quite simply that if God granted him life in 30 years, he would have planted so many more that these 10,000 would be a drop of water in the ocean. Besides, he was now studying the reproduction of beech trees and had a nursery of seedlings grown from beech nuts near his cottage. He was also considering birches for the valleys, where he told me there was a certain amount of moisture a few yards below the surface of the soil. The next day we parted. The following year came the War of 1914, in which I was involved for the next 5 years. An infantryman hardly had time for reflecting upon trees. To tell the truth, the thing itself had made no impression upon me. I had considered it as a hobby, like a stamp collection, and had forgotten it. The war over, I found again the desire to breathe fresh air for a while, and I again took the road to the barren lands. The countryside had not changed. However, beyond the deserted village, I glimpsed in the distance a sort of grayish mist that covered the mountaintops like a carpet. Since the day before, I had begun to think again of the shepherd tree planter. 10,000 oaks, I reflected, really take up quite a bit of space. Elzéar Bouffier had changed jobs. Now he had only 4 sheep, but instead 100 beehives. He'd got rid of the sheep because they threatened his young trees. The oaks of 1910 were then 10 years old and taller than either of us. It was an impressive spectacle. I was literally speechless, and as he did not talk, we spent the whole day walking in silence through his forest. When you remembered that all this had sprung from the hands and the soul of this one man without technical resources, you understood that men could be as effectual as God in other realms than that of destruction. He had pursued his plan, and beech trees as high as my shoulder, spreading out as far as the eye could reach, confirmed it. He showed me his handsome clumps of birch planted 5 years before, in all the valleys where he had guessed, and rightly, that there was moisture almost at the surface of the ground. Creation seemed to come about in a sort of chain reaction. He did not worry about it. He was determinedly pursuing his task in all its simplicity. But as we went back toward the village, I saw water flowing in brooks that had been dry since the memory of man. This was the most impressive result of chain reaction that I had seen. The wind, too, scattered seeds. As the water reappeared, so there reappeared willows, rushes, meadows, gardens, flowers, and a certain purpose in being alive. But the transformation took place so gradually, it became part of the pattern without causing any astonishment. Hunters, climbing into the wilderness in pursuit of hares or wild boar, had of course noticed the sudden growth of little trees, but it had attributed it to some natural caprice of the earth. That is why no one meddled with Elzéar Bouffier's work. If he had been detected, he would have had opposition, but he was indetectable. To have anything like a precise idea of this exceptional character, one must not forget that he worked in total solitude. In 1933, he received a visit from a forest ranger who notified him of an order against lighting fires out of doors for fear of endangering the growth of this natural forest. It was the first time, the man told him naively, that he'd ever heard of a forest growing of its own accord. At that time, Bouffier was about to plant beeches at a spot some 12 kilometers from his cottage. In order to avoid traveling back and forth, for he was then 75, he planned to build a stone cabin right at the planting area, and the next year he did so. In 1935, a whole delegation came from the government to examine the natural forest. There was a high official from the Forest Service, a deputy, technicians. There was a great deal of ineffectual talk. It was decided that something must be done, and fortunately, nothing was done except the only helpful thing. The whole forest was placed under the protection of the state and charcoal burning prohibited. For it was impossible not to be captivated by the beauty of those young trees and the fullness of health, and they cast their spell over the deputy himself. A friend of mine was among the forestry officers of the delegation. To him, I explained the mystery. One day, the following week, we went together to see Elzéar Bouffier. He found him hard at work, some 10 kilometers from the spot where the inspection had taken place. In the direction from which we had come, the slopes now were covered with trees, 20 to 25 feet tall. I remembered how the land had looked in 1913, a desert. Peaceful, regular toil, the vigorous mountain air, frugality, and above all, serenity of spirit had endowed this old man with awe-inspiring health. He was one of God's athletes. I wondered how many more acres he was going to cover with trees. He had discovered a wonderful way to be happy. I saw Exiled Bouffier for the last time in June of 1945. He was then 87. I had started back along the route through the wastelands, but now, in spite of the disorder in which the war had left the country, there was a bus running between the Durance Valley and the mountain. I attributed the fact that I no longer recognized the scenes of my earlier journeys to this relatively speedy transportation. It seemed to me, too, that the route took me through new territory. It took the name of a village to convince me that I was actually in that region that had been all ruins and desolation. The bus put me down at Vergon. In 1913, this hamlet of 10 or 12 houses had 3 inhabitants. They'd been savage creatures, hating one another. Nettles had been feeding upon the remains of abandoned houses at that time. Their condition had been beyond hope. Everything was changed, even the air. Instead of the harsh, dry winds that used to attack me, a gentle breeze was blowing, laden with scents. A sound like water came from the mountains. It was the wind in the forest. Most amazing of all, I heard the actual sound of water falling into a pool. I saw that a fountain had been built, that it flowed freely, and, what touched me most, that someone had planted a linden beside it, a linden that must have been 4 years old, already in full leaf, the incontestable symbol of resurrection. Hope, then, had returned. Ruins had been cleared away, dilapidated walls torn down, and 5 houses restored. Now there were 28 inhabitants. The new houses, freshly plastered, were surrounded by gardens where vegetables and flowers grew in orderly confusion. It was now a village where one would like to live. On the lower slopes of the mountain, I saw little fields of barley and rye. Deep in the narrow valleys, the meadows were turning green. It has taken only 8 years since then for the whole countryside to glow with health and prosperity. On the site of ruins I had seen in 1913, now stand neat farms, testifying to a happy and comfortable life. The old streams, fed by the rains and snows that the forest conserves, are flowing again. On each farm, in groves of maples, fountain pools overflow onto the carpets of fresh mint. When I reflect that one man, armed only with his own physical and moral resources, was able to cause this land of Canaan to spring from the wasteland, I am convinced that in spite of everything, humanity is admirable. But when I compute the unfailing greatness of spirit and the tenacity of benevolence that it must have taken to achieve this result, I am taken with an immense respect for that old and unlearned peasant who was able to complete a work worthy of God. Exiled Bouffier died peacefully in 1947 at the hospice in Banon. Churches of late have felt exiled by pandemic restrictions, by financial challenges, by changing societal expectations. As Jeremiah offers hope, we find hope in planting new trees or new ideas, no matter the conditions in which we find ourselves. We find hope in putting down new roots in the God-nurtured soil and in branching out in ways we have yet to imagine. One person can bring new life to a barren world. One person can restore hope in the midst of exile. Imagine what a whole church can do. As we wander through this exhausting and uncertain landscape of pandemic exile, Jeremiah calls us to practices that nourish and sustain us, practices that root us to our living God and affirm us in God's extraordinary love. And maybe you will find nourishment in planting trees or spending time with trees. Hope will grow into sturdy branches when we are rooted in God's love and nourished by the streams of living waters. Thanks be to God.